I think women, especially in some male-dominated sectors, which there still are, like that's a challenge. And then adding in being an Indigenous woman on top of that. And I think sometimes when you're the only woman or the only Indigenous woman in a room, it can be challenging. And I think that, there's a number of examples that I think about over the years where it is quite isolating and lonely sometimes. And I think that there's a perception that because you are a First Nations woman, that you're in a conflict of interest in some settings. And I find that just absolutely ridiculous and outrageous.
Gwe Nindaluizi Pam Palmater, and I'm the host of this show, The Warrior Life. I'm an Indigenous lawyer, professor, author, and activist from Eel River Bar First Nation, otherwise known as Ugbaganjig. My motto is education for action on Indigenous rights, social justice, and protecting the planet. And on this podcast, you get an education of a totally different kind. It's enriched by the cultures, insights, lived experiences, traditional knowledge of a wide variety of Indigenous peoples all over Turtle Island here in North America. Could be Indigenous authors, artists, musicians, academics, or it could be leaders of all kinds, activists, land defenders, and water protectors, all of whom are, in their own unique ways, on the front lines of Indigenous resistance, resurgence, and revitalization. And you don't even know how excited I am for this show because we have yet another Mi'kmaq person that is in the house. So stay tuned. You really don't want to miss this. Welcome back to the Warrior Life podcast. I'm your host, Pam Palmater, and I am so excited to have another Mi'kmaq person on the show. I mean, if I had it my way, it would be all Mi'kmaq people, but there's just so many awesome people from different First Nations and Native American groups that I can't just focus on the Mi'kmaq. But this person is amazing. She's not from my reserve, but we are both from Mi'kmaq First Nations in New Brunswick. And can I also just say how happy I am to get to talk to another lawyer? I know not everybody likes lawyers, but we're in the category of those good ones. So our group, especially Mi'kmaq lawyers, keeps getting bigger and bigger. Deborah Richardson is the Deputy Minister of Health for the province of Ontario. I mean, that is an amazing position to be in. She's a seasoned executive, so this isn't her first go-round in leadership. She's a business-savvy lawyer, a change maker, and she has 3 decades, hard to believe because we're so young, but 3 decades of private, not-for-profit, and public experience. When people talk about her, she is not one of those cranky bosses, one of those overlord bosses. She's really known for her caring and collaborative style. She really focuses on relationships, and I think that's what has contributed to her being an authentic leader as well as a humanitarian. And that's hard to come by these days. Rarely do we get to see a true, authentic person in leadership. Usually they only show us the big boss side of things. And she's served in many, many leadership positions, federal, provincial governments, and all that to say, and we're going to talk about all of that and hear about all of the wisdom, advice, experience she's had as an Indigenous woman in leadership. I'm so excited to welcome you to the podcast, Deputy Minister of Health for the province of Ontario, Deborah Richardson.
Nin Dalawisi, Wabano Nungaskwe, Deleawe, when big is Yuik. Hello, everyone, and hello, Pam. It's so wonderful to be here. My name is Deborah Richardson. My spirit name is Eastern Star Woman, and I am from Pabineau First Nation on the North Shore of New Brunswick, and it's just so wonderful to be here.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm pumped because we're from the same province as well, you know? So we're not that far apart. And I think you and I were talking before the show about potentially there we could be related somehow because you have family members that are from Eel River.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It really is, everyone's related to everyone in some
Yeah.
way or another. So my dad's family is from Pabineau First Nation, but also from Lestigush. But his great grandmother, or my great great grandmother, was from Eel River Bar, Mary Narby. So we also have connections within that community as well. And interesting, my grandmother was a midwife, and
Mm.
delivered some of the babies actually in the Eel River Bar back in the day. But and I know a lot of my family grew up in kind of Charlotte and Dalhousie and all around Eel River Bar. So yeah, we definitely could in some way. We'll have to look back at our family trees and history.
I know, and see them all come together, and you'll find out all of our, you know, those relatives. They're all of our cousins. But for people who don't know about Pabineau, like we talk a lot about the Mi'kmaq Nation on here, but not everybody is familiar with that First Nation. Could you just talk a little bit about it, where it's located, cool things about the community?
Sure. So Pabineau is a pretty itty bitty community. It's about 400 peeps, probably about, I don't know, 150 on reserve. And, my uncle's chief, my dad's on council. It's a great community. It's the most beautiful thing, and it's probably one of my most peaceful places on earth that I ever go to, is Pabineau Falls. It's so beautiful. If you ever just want to go and walk through the bush and just sit on the edge of the falls, it's just so serene and so absolutely beautiful. It's really close to Bathurst. That's kind of the city that's close to Pabineau, and it's just beautiful. It's close to the ocean, as you know, Eel River Bar. Whenever you drive across that
Little strip.
strip, it's funny. I always have this feeling of being home. And it starts from Dalhousie, even though the whole mill is shut down, that smell of sulfur is gone. But whenever you used to drive across that Eel River Bar, I would always feel like I was close to home, and I always liked actually even going the long route
Yeah.
instead of on the highway, that kind of the old highway, to get to go to Pabineau Falls when I have a chance to. So yeah, it's a pretty amazing place, and I love it. I don't get home as much as I'd like
Mm.
to. I know through, like, when I was in university, I had a lot more flexibility. Now I probably only get back a couple of times a year.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things when we're not living on our territory for the purposes of work, for example, or education. There's been a couple years, probably my mom would say more than a couple years, where I was not getting home enough, maybe only once a year, but you know, uh now I'm there maybe 4 or 5 times a year. I'm really trying. I'm really trying to get home, maintain all of those connections. And for people who don't know, can you talk a little bit about Papineau's traditional name or what the meaning is in Mi'kmaq?
Sure. It's Winbigajowik, which basically means roughly flowing or evil flowing waters, is like the literal translation. And it's fitting, right? Because it's Pabineau Falls. And so that's the Mi'kmaq name. And yeah, so it's like I said, it's a beautiful place. I really encourage anyone to go by the north. If you're up at the North Shore of New Brunswick, to go by there,
Mm.
because it's beautiful territory. It really is.
Oh, it is, and they have great powwows too. My brother-in-law is a band member at Papineau, and he's always there at the powwows. Everybody loves Papineau. Everybody loves the Mi'kmaq Nation. Everybody loves our territory, and so I'm so glad to have you on the show, and I know you're in the position now, Deputy Minister of Health, and I can't wait to talk to you about that, but people like to hear people's life stories, the journey to how they got to where they are, because sometimes We think, oh, right out of high school, you have to know, here are the 5 steps I'm going to take, and that's the end result. Sometimes it doesn't work that way. You just have different experiences and then you end up where you are. So I'd love to hear about your educational and professional journey, because you have occupied more positions in leadership in governments than I can count.
Sure. I mean, what's interesting, where you came from always makes who you are, right? And defines your journey. And so my dad left New Brunswick, joined the military, didn't even have high school, and moved out. His very first posting was Alsace, Saskatchewan. And so that's how he met my mom. And, year and a half later, I arrived. And so we had a journey of living in different cities and actually countries growing up because of being in the military. And I think that gave me a lot of skills of being versatile and being used to change, and forced me to be social and get to know people, and so that was really helpful. But we were always really connected to Saskatchewan, where my mom is from. My mom is German and Scottish, from a small town called Kindersley, Saskatchewan, and my dad is Mi'kmaq from Pabineau, and so we would spend a lot of time every summer going from one to the other. And you can imagine the change that like I had 5 different high schools. It was grade 13 back then, but moved all over the place, and then ended up in Ottawa for university. And I did an undergrad, didn't know what the heck I wanted to do. And by chance, I saw this sign about, hey, who wants to write the LSAT? And I actually wrote the LSAT. And then applied to law school. And I did the pre-law program in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and then went to law school at University of Ottawa. And there was amazing people from all different First Nations from right across Canada that were there. I think we had a very large contingent of First Nations law students at the time. And it was incredible because the late Trish Montour was one of the professors. It was her first year teaching there.
Wow.
And I used to actually babysit for her kids. And Darlene Johnson. So we had 2 law professors. And, it was just so interesting because the whole concept of property, like the whole first semester, they taught what's the Indigenous worldview of property. And I remember a lot of my non-Indigenous fellow students were like, why are we learning this stuff? But it was so important for people to understand the concepts. And who better to teach it than Trish Montour? And then during that time, it was the Royal Commission for Aboriginal People. So, I was kind of involved as a student. And I remember there was the first People's Conference on the Constitution back then. And I just became just so interested. And I was a runner, like a volunteer. I think we actually got paid. I can't remember if we volunteer got paid. So did that. And then applied to article, and I was really interested in criminal law because I'm a real social justice advocate. And so I articled at a criminal defense firm in Ottawa. And then lo and behold, I ended up meeting the father of my children, and I moved to Toronto. And I didn't have any contacts then. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. At the time, I was offered a position to be like duty counsel, and I didn't really want to do that. And so then by chance, I just started using my network, and I talked to one person and got 3 or 4 names from them and got 3 or 4 names from them. And I went to meet a bunch of people. And finally, this fellow from the Royal Bank said, have you ever thought about business banking? And I was like, I failed grade 10 math. I'm not sure if that's the best profession for me. But you know what? I did it. And it was the darn best thing I ever did, because I learned how to read a financial statement. I learned how to use all my legal skills about building an argument about why we should fund a certain business. But I also became very actively involved with First Nations employees at the Royal Bank. And so it was just absolutely incredible experience. So during that time, I was approached by the Friendship Center in Toronto, and they said, look, we've had some challenges with executive directors. Could you apply? And so I did apply, and my dad at the time was mortified because after he retired from the military, he became VP at a bank and really focused in on lending to Indigenous communities and building capacity with First Nations youth, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit youth, actually. So I applied for it, and it was such a wonderful experience working in the community. I had never worked with the homeless population. I didn't know a lot of spirituality and culture either. There wasn't really a lot of that in New Brunswick or in other spaces and places that I'd been to. And so I really started to get exposure to, we created an elders council and learning cultural values and how to lead with not just creating an elders council, but how does that elders council work with the board of directors and with the staff? And we went through a naming exercise, and we had an Eagle staff presented to the community and learning the teachings and the responsibilities that were attached to that. So I did that for 3 years, and it was funny because at the end of the 3 years, I said, okay, like, I'm going to give you notice, I'm going to leave. And they were shocked because, a lot of not-for-profits are used to like kind of firing people, or they're not used to people leaving on a voluntary basis, I don't think. And so I left, and I went to work for a company called OI Employee Leasing that was in litigation with the federal government on Indian taxation issues. And so I worked out of Six Nations. And, at the time, Pam, you'll probably remember this, the federal government wanted to introduce the First Nations Governance Act.
Yes.
And so, I was helping organize protests. Like, we did that big teepee protest at Union Station and other places. And I remember going to hearings with Indian Affairs at the time. I think Bob Nault was the minister.
Yep.
And I remember they had come to our annual general meeting at the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto and said that they wanted to just present what they were doing. And we said, okay, this isn't consultation. But yet when I went on the website for FNGA, or First Nations Governance Act, it showed that they had consulted with the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto. So I went to the hearings to point that out when they were going across to hearings to talk about perspectives. So then after that, I worked with OI for about, and Roger Bonswin was the owner of OI, and it was such a great experience learning from him. And I know Roger now has Alzheimer's, but it was just a wonderful experience, and I have the fondest memories. But what's fascinating is during that time, Indian Affairs approached me and said, we have an associate regional director general position. Would you be interested in applying? And I remember, again, telling my dad, and he was mortified that I would be thinking of, so first I left the bank, right? I could have been at VP. Then I go to work at the Friendship Center, and now I'm going to work for the Indian agent, right? And so I applied for it, and I won the competition, and I ended up becoming the associate and then the regional director general for Ontario. And it was, I was there for about 4 years, and I was able to visit almost every single First Nation in the province of Ontario. And those are memories that will be in my heart forever, because we live in such a beautiful province. There's 26 fly-in remote communities. We have, the largest reserve in Canada, which is Six Nations. It's just such a beautiful place that we live in. And that I had, a lot of heartache, but a lot of laughs during that time. And so I did that for 4 years. And then, I don't know if you'll recall, but, there was the Ipperwash inquiry, and there was the fatal shooting of unarmed man in Ipperwash Park, Dudley George. And one of the recommendations from the inquiry, which was to create a standalone Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs, it was called at the time. So I was approached by the Deputy Minister of the day and asked if I wanted to come in and be the Assistant Deputy Minister of setting up the Aboriginal Relationships and Ministry Partnerships Division, I think it was called. And so government loves these long titles. And so I went in and I did that. And oh my gosh. So the late Sam George, um, I hired him right off the bat to come in, and he was diagnosed with cancer during that time and passed away. But it was such a pleasure meeting with him and hearing the stories about how he'd driven right across Ontario to really drum up support for an inquiry into the death of his his brother. And so it was just an honor to do that. And so I did that for about 4 years. And then I went to Northern Development and Mines and worked on some of the relationship and capacity piece with First Nations in the Ring of Fire. And about a year into that, I was called by one of my daughter's schools. So I didn't share. So my husband and I, Bob, have 5 kids between the two of us, and he's from Nipissing First Nation, and I'm actually in Nipissing First Nation. We live here. But my eldest daughter was having some mental health issues, and I felt so horrible that I didn't have a line of sight into that. Like sometimes we get so busy in our lives, and I was traveling and doing these things, and I didn't pay attention to what was the most important. So I went to the government at the time, my deputy minister, and I said, I need a 1-year leave of absence. It ended up being 2, but and I went to work for. I was able to work from home, and I went to work with my brother and former National Chief Phil Fontaine with their company called Ishkunigan. And that was out of Akwesasne. And so I did that for 2 years. And it was a wonderful experience. We did all kinds of work. And it was interesting because even some of the First Nations that I had done work with over the years actually hired Ishkunigan for me to do some of the interesting work that they wanted to do. So it shows the great relationships that we were all able to establish. And at the end of 2 years at Ishkunigan, I got a call so in government in the province, the highest person that's the boss of all the deputy ministers, and the deputy ministers are basically kind of the CEOs of the different departments or ministries in the province, they're called. And the Secretary of Cabinet called me and he said, hey, we'd like you to be the Deputy Minister of Aboriginal Affairs. And so I said, well, I'm not interested in being some token deputy minister. And there was another thing, like I was able to work from home. I was tax exempt because we're working at a Nipissing First Nation. And all of a sudden it's like, do you want to be the deputy minister? And so I said to him, are you guys interested in doing something? And he said, absolutely, we want to move. And so I made a decision to come, and we did move. We did some incredible things when we were there. And part of it is as public servants is seizing the opportunity and being a little bit opportunistic. So I have some pretty good examples I can give you once I kind of walk through some of the other things. So I became deputy minister there for 4 years. Then I became deputy minister at corrections during COVID, which was very challenging. Did that for almost 3 years. And then I was deputy minister for the Treasury Board Secretariat, which the Treasury Board is basically, every government department has to go to the Treasury Board and ask for permission to spend their money and how they spend their money. So the province of Ontario is a $202 billion budget. So I was responsible for overseeing that. And then also all the human resources. So there's 67,000 employees in the Ontario Public Service. And so all of the human resource pieces, payroll, policy, HR, workplace harassment, discrimination, all that were under my portfolio, and then also supply chain and that too. So then I know it was big, and during that time I was diagnosed with cancer, but that's a whole other story. We'll get into that. But and then I became deputy minister of health, which is, oh my goodness, it's such an incredible opportunity. It's an $80 billion budget. It overseas, like there's over 144 hospitals in the province. And then, all the OHIP and the drugs and the physician payments, all of that is a part of that envelope. And so, 80 billion it's bigger than most provinces or territories.
Yeah.
What do you think of it? So yeah, so that's my career. I'm sorry it was very long-winded, but it's a journey
No.
because it's unconventional in a way.
It is. It so is, because you don't always know what opportunities are gonna be there in the future, from connections, from work you're doing in one place, which has impressed someone that you don't even know, and then later on, they're asking you to do other jobs, and then that leads to something else. Like, I always tell youth who are worried when they don't see a clear path to the very end, it's like, Don't worry about it, just be open, make connections, embrace opportunities, learn, you don't have to commit to stay in one place forever anymore. You can do a multitude of things. And wow, I can't believe all these things that you've done. Did you ever imagine when you were in high school that you were going to be the Deputy Minister of Health for the province of Ontario?
Oh, absolutely not. I had no idea. I mean, even the day that I had said in university, in third-year university, when I decided to write my LSAT, I also went to learn about the OPP and just the police and what that was about. Like, I just didn't know, right? Like,
Mhm.
I was just kind of finding myself. And even when you look at it, like, I'm not a practicing lawyer, and I went to law school,
Mhm.
right? I'm no longer a business banker, but I did it. But I think that as we're doing our little journey that's called life, you just have this toolbox and you just keep whipping stuff into it. And
Mhm.
and it might not make sense to anybody who's not us, uh, in terms of yourself, but it actually makes a lot of sense. And that saying
Yeah.
about you never know who your boss is going to be one day is so true. And also, there was a teaching that an Inuit elder had given myself and all the team at the Native Canadian Centre of Toronto was, about gossip and how it's like a harpoon, and once you put it into a seal, you can't pull it out. And so I always try to lead my life with kindness and good values, and treating people with respect and dignity, no matter if you're homeless or you're
Mhm.
the CEO of a bank. I treat everybody the same in terms of where they're at, and nobody is better than anybody else.
Such a good way to look at it, I've heard that too from elders, like, "You have to take people where they're at. We can't put our expectations on other people. We didn't live their lives, we don't have their circumstances, we never know what's going on behind the facade," like the forward-facing, way that people are, so I think that's a good way of looking at it. One of the things I know I'm gonna get asked is, what's the difference between the Minister of Health, the Deputy Minister of Health, and the Assistant Deputy Minister of Health? So just, in the province, if someone were to say, "Hey, what's the difference with all these things?" Are there core differences?
There's core differences, and I can drill it down to a First Nations level. The minister is equivalent to a chief because they're an elected official that's representing a contingency. The deputy minister is the executive director or the CEO, of the First Nation. In this case, I'm the CEO of the Ministry of Health. And the assistant deputy minister would be like, your director of social, your director of health, your director of public works. So that's basically how it is. So I am the most senior unelected official in government. So the government of the day comes in. It's how democracy
Yeah.
works. And then the government sets their priorities. And as bureaucrats or as the non-elected people, it's our responsibility to help the government achieve their objectives. And to do that, you develop policy options and risks, and you present them to government, and then they make the decisions based on those things.
So would it be fair to say that you're the band manager for health?
Yeah, yeah, totally. That's
That's
exactly,
so
I'm the
cool.
band manager, right? It depends what you call it in different places, right? But
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
the
yeah.
executive director, you're the band manager, but that's exactly it. You got it.
Oh, that's so cool. I love learning all of this. And I spent 10 years in the feds too, but not in positions like you are. So it's interesting to learn. And after a podcast, people always ask me questions. And so I thought, oh, there's a question I'm sure someone's going to want to know. Um, and so in my time in the feds, 10 years, Justice Canada and Indian Affairs as it then was, there's lots of silly things that happen. There's great stories, meeting with First Nations and all that. Do you have a funny story of anything that's ever happened in one of your positions, or a lesson learned or something from all of the positions you've ever been in?
There's so many stories, but as the deputy minister and sort of as the minister's office staff, you're always responsible for just kind of taking care of the minister and making sure the minister is okay. So there was one occasion when we were at a federal, provincial, territorial meeting up in Yellowknife with our minister, and our minister, really cared, really liked kind of rolling up his sleeves and getting to know people no matter where we were, and we saw this in a number of occasions. But so I'm sitting there chatting with the chief of staff, and then all of a sudden we turn around and we're like, "Where's the minister?" And we look, and the ice is breaking, and he's going across on a snowmobile with some stranger, we didn't know who it was, across the lake. And so we were like, "Oh my gosh, like we're supposed to be taking care of the minister, and he's long gone." And he came back, and he was fine. We were worried about the lake, and he had a bunch of jerky that somebody had seen him and must have said, "Hey, I got some jerky. You want to come with me, and I'll go across the lake?" So, and there's just countless stories
Oh.
of this particular minister. He was lovely and really did want to roll up his sleeves, like I said, and get to know people. It was so hilarious. It's like we're kind of not doing our job.
Oh my gosh. I love things like that. Life doesn't always work the
Yeah.
way you expect it. And you think about the funny nature of it, the fact that, the minister, it's very formal, very respectful position, and you've lost him. Like, good job.
Oh, it was, and there was another story. We were up in, I can't remember if it was Constance Lake First Nation or Arrowland. It was one of the two. And the same thing. We were traveling up with the deputy minister of Treasury Board at the time. She was a deputy minister of Treasury Board, and the minister. And I was in a car behind them, and they were in a car. And the car pulls over, and it's like really, really deep snow. And he gets out of the car and he goes down into the ditch in the deep snow and is almost up to his chest, because the First Nation was so concerned about the safety of this bridge that the forestry road, the forestry company had built, and they felt that it wasn't properly maintained. So he went down to check it out and see what they were talking about. But yeah, it was just another one. I was like, what is going on? And there he was down below checking it out. It's awesome. It's so warm to see, right? People are only human.
Exactly. And we're all in this, together ultimately. One of the things I wanted to ask you, because I'm always impressed by women in leadership, but especially Indigenous women in leadership, because if you think of the trajectory, it was never Indigenous people in leadership. And then it was Indigenous men, for many, many, many years, is only Indigenous men. And now, like, we just have so many Indigenous women in all different kinds of leadership positions. It just really inspires me. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about is, you've held a lot of leadership positions. Were there any particular challenges that you had to get over? I mean, obviously, you don't have to say anything specific, but there must have been like challenges that, seemed impenetrable at times.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think women, especially in some male-dominated sectors, which there still are, like that's a challenge. And then adding in being an Indigenous woman on top of that. And I think sometimes when you're the only woman or the only Indigenous woman in a room, it can be challenging. And I think that there's a number of examples that I think about over the years, where it is quite isolating and lonely sometimes. And I think that there's a perception that because you are a First Nations woman, that you're in a conflict of interest in some settings. And I find that just absolutely ridiculous and outrageous, suggesting that you can't be a professional just because of who you are, and what's in your blood. And so there have been times, especially earlier in my career, where this became an issue. And now I'm in a position that I can take it right on. And if it happens to somebody else, I'm the first in their corner to challenge that system should that happen, and to create an environment where all of us feel like we belong, not that you're kind of the outsider. And so that definitely has happened over the years. And I think that times are changing. I think there's been a lot of movements for women in particular that have really heightened awareness for people. And I think also as more and more people within our community are becoming a lot more traditional, recognizing the value and the importance of women in leadership roles, and us as those who carry life and the sacredness of that. I think times are changing, and I think people are more and more aware of what they say or how they behave or what they do. And I really do think times are changing.
Well, it's good to hear that, and I love all of the research that's been done, about how big corporations that have more women, or at least like 50% women on their boards, or, in charge, are actually more profitable. So I think, the world has a lot to learn from women, Indigenous women in particular. And the other thing I wanted to know is, in all of your positions of leadership, like, because you've had a lot, are there any lessons learned or particular skills you got from those positions that, you look back on and, you didn't have when you first started out?
For sure. And I think a lot of it has to do with communication style in a way, because, when I was younger and I had kind of that fire in my belly, I would be a lot more confrontational when I heard things that I didn't agree with, especially when it was regarding in terms of First Nations people, and communities. But as I matured, I find you can get to the same objectives and even better in ways that entail influencing in a different way with, getting buy-in with other people, building some consensus in a way that isn't necessarily in a room, spending time with people to educate folks about whatever it is you're trying to move forward. And a perfect example of this one is when we were in Ontario. I was in Ontario. I was a deputy minister. Kathleen Wynne was the premier. And remember, the TRC had just come out. And so Kathleen Wynne said, I'd really like to issue an apology. And I said, well, you can't do an apology without actually putting some money and some resources into that apology. And so my colleague deputies at the time, everybody is struggling with their own priorities. And so I worked with them one-on-one in terms of coming up with ideas that I had heard from the community, and worked with the community as well on some of those ideas about things that people have been trying to put forward for a long time. And we were able to secure, it was $250 million. It was a lot of money. And we were able to negotiate an all-party apology in the legislature at Queen's Park. And we started it with, the Little Boy Water Drum came out, and there was a Medeoan ceremony on the grounds of Queen's Park. Wow. And then I looked up in the gallery, I guess it's called, and there was 80 residential school survivors sitting there seeing, the regional chief, the head of the Inuit Paraset, the head of the Métis Nation of Ontario, and a residential school survivor speaking. Because I think the last time that somebody who was non-elected spoke on the floor was Nelson Mandela at Queen's Park. And these very distinguished Indigenous leaders spoke about what it meant to them. And then all parties did the apology. And I think that was just kind of a highlight for me professionally and personally. But it was about how we did it. Like, we worked with Indigenous partners side by side. I worked with my colleague deputy ministers, kept them in the loop on a regular basis. Hey, this is what's going on. This is we heard back from partners. This is what and then we ended up with a final product. And I remember the night before we were making the announcement, I had a call with all the Grand Chiefs and the regional chief. And I remember that one of the Grand Chiefs at the time said, you have to pinch me. I think I'm dreaming that this is actually happening. And it was just so wonderful to hear. So yeah, what I've learned is you need to bring people along. You need to change your style of delivery if you're not getting traction, how you're getting it. And there is room and space for being gentle. And then there's room and space for being a bit more forceful. And it's always, as I mature, and I will continue to mature, there's always a balance between those two, right? And you always try to level that. So sometimes you get something with sweetness, sometimes you get something with a little bit more saltiness.
Sweet and salty. It's funny, outside of this podcast, like in the professional realm, when I just ask people questions, because I'm one of those, lawyer people that just ask everybody questions. I've found that when I ask people about leadership, like, what did you learn? Was there any particular skill or anything? And it's almost always, oh yeah, I learned how to work with HR when dealing with employee complaints, or yes, I'm much better at managing budgets or whatever. And so it's really refreshing to hear you talk about, well, relationships with people. And how to engage with people and how to get things done. Because for anyone who's not in politics, to have an all party, everybody agree, can you imagine? That's no small feat. Like that's really relationship and faith and trust. And so to me, relationship is just so important. Obviously, like in First Nations, relationships are everything, whether it's with other First Nations or with businesses or government. So I really like that you focus on relationships. Now, here's another question, and it relates to our lives because our personal lives inevitably impact whatever it is we're doing, whatever profession, whatever job. And, you've been in many leadership jobs. Is there anything from your personal life that you think has impacted how you engage as a leader?
For sure. I mean, I spoke a little bit about just living in different parts of Canada and, living overseas and needing to be able to adapt to different people and different cultures. My dad had lived in Peru for a period of time, and we brought all of our kids down to Peru a couple of times, and just seeing them experience different, going into the jungle and meeting with some of the tribes and some of the tribal leaders and seeing how different people live. I think all of those things enrich who you are, because the more we expose ourselves to different people, the more you have empathy, and not sympathy necessarily, it's empathy, right? And that means I'm going to come down with you and I'm going to understand where you're at. And so I think definitely in terms of just the type of life that I've lived, I think also, my husband and I are big powwow people. He MCs a lot of powwow. I'm a Shkabewis helper that helps organize like kind of grand entries and blanket dances and air traffic control at the MC stand. But I think just powwow life has also had an impact of just being kind of immersed in culture. And then the spirituality. I spoke about my journey that sort of started at the Native Canadian Center of Toronto, but has really carried on as, like I said, as I married a Deowin man, and have really immersed in ceremony and culture. And you don't have to be a deputy minister or a chief or a director or a university professor to be a leader.
Mhm.
You can be a leader like in no matter what you're doing. And I think if you're leading with values of kindness and humility, where I don't get it right all the time,
Mhm.
and I think if you lead with those values and truth and it just honesty,
Mhm.
and integrity, then I think that you inspire and motivate people when you behave in those ways. We've all had really crappy bosses or crappy leaders, and I told myself I will never be that person, right? And I don't want anyone to say that about me. Oh my God, I'll never be like Deborah, right? I want people to say,
Mhm.
oh my gosh, what would Deborah do in this situation? I'd
Yeah.
love to do what she did, right? And that's what I strive to do every single day, to be a better person and a better leader, so that everyone around me wants to be inspired and motivated to do better, just like they inspire and motivate me to do better.
Yeah, exactly. And you can never, in the world of people, not everybody is going to like everybody else, but you can respect someone for having fair leadership, compassionate, empathetic leadership. And that's one of the things I like about you, because there's also the informal aspect. So people won't necessarily know. When I think about it, I was having some challenges not that long ago, the social media world. And who reaches out but the Deputy Minister of Health for the province of Ontario? I mean, like, when I think about it now, it's like, what? What reaches out and says some kind words of support, which literally changed my entire day, lifted my spirits, and reminded me, no matter what bad thing is happening or bad thing someone is saying, there's many other people out there that are kind-hearted and support you and lift you up. And it's only now that I'm thinking, but wait, she's the Deputy Minister of Health and she's reaching out to support me, to send me a kind note. And I was like, so I like that part about leadership, that you can actually be a leader amongst people, not elected per se, but that you're just there lifting other people up. And
And it's interesting. I was just thinking when you're talking, like the other thing that sort of happened to me, and is during COVID I was diagnosed with cancer, and it was HER2 triple positive breast cancer, which was very serious, and I needed
wow.
surgery, and I needed chemo and radiation and
Wow.
Herceptin, and that triggered my leadership too, because I needed to be bold to um, not to say, look at me, I have cancer, but to say, look at me, I have cancer. We're in this together. And I can't tell you how many First Nations women have reached out to me because they've had the same journey, and to create that network. And there was some First Nations women that had had cancer that held my hand through every step of the way. And that triggered my leadership style too, because I spoke about it in very public settings. Like I do, we do sessions with 12,000 people in government, and I was very open about my journey, and the amount of people that reached out that said, oh my gosh, like that happened to my mom, that happened to me, that happened to my sister, it happened to my aunt. And it gives that human connection with
Mm.
each of us as we share a piece of ourselves. And it's hard to do that, especially for people who are very private. And so I had to make a choice at that time. Was I going to share my cancer journey, or was I going to keep it to myself? And I chose to share it. And I'm so happy I did, because it opened up all these other relationships and this environment where people felt comfortable sharing a piece of them as well.
And it's a frightening thing. That's a frightening, I mean, I don't need to tell you, that's a frightening thing. We all have ourselves or family members or close friends who've all had experiences with cancer in one way or another. Sometimes they did very well and sometimes they didn't. And so it's frightening. People, it is very private. You're going through a multitude of changes. You're in a very vulnerable position. I can only imagine. And so you effectively ended up being a leader in your own life too, saying, you know what, throughout this, not only am I going to fight, but I am going to try to let other people know that they're not alone. Because I've seen it happen, in my own family, how
Yeah.
people feel isolated. They don't want to bother anybody. There's some aspects to it that, oh, it's a little bit embarrassing, or, I feel
Yeah,
very
well, you
vulnerable.
lose
I don't
your
want
hair,
to.
right? You're losing your hair. I had no eyelashes. Your eyes are watering all the time. My skin was red and blotchy. And, but that's where you need to focus in on your own, what makes you strong, right? Like, how do you make, so for me, it was spirituality. It was really focusing in on my mental and emotional well-being, because what was going on in my physical well-being was chaos. And what happened, like I said, I had a family that was incredibly supportive, a husband that's very spiritual and helped me grounded in ceremonies, people that had traditional medicines that they wanted to share, and all of those things. And like I said, there was chiefs from up north that reached out to me, that the same types of journey they were going through. It's almost like this community of people that you don't even recognize, that people are going through things. So I'm just so grateful. And I had a really good boss who said, you know what, Deborah, if you want to work through chemo, you take that week of chemo off and you rest and take care, and come the 2 weeks after. And that's what I did. And I would have never been able to do that without a supportive leader and a boss. And that's why I will always be that supportive and leader and boss, because I will be absolutely the most loyal person in the world to my boss, because of what she did for me in my most vulnerable time of my life.
Lessons learned,
Mhm.
and sometimes I wonder if leaders really recognize, like, the really kind, compassionate leaders recognize the impact they have on people. Like, there are people in my life who have helped me in different circumstances that I will be loyal to them until the day I visit the ancestors. Like, to come in at a time when it's really, really hard, or when, oh, maybe someone will say something if you're supporting that person, like, just to put yourself out there. And I have to say, personally, seeing you post updates on social media, and seeing that you were going through it, and then when you were getting on the other side and getting better, that was very spirit uplifting, because like I said, we've all lost family members who didn't, win that battle. And so to see, okay, but here's someone who did, it gives everybody hope. And I really appreciate that you did that. And I'm sure there's many other people out there who would be too embarrassed or too shy to tell you that, who were sitting back saying, okay, I wonder what Deborah's saying today. I wonder how she is. And everything, like, you were just always positive and hopeful. And
Oh, thanks for that.
I really like that about you. Um, okay. So here's some questions that I have that I'm going to ask you the same questions I get. So when I worked at Justice Canada and Indian Affairs as a director, I had some of my Indigenous friends and family say, yeah, right on, go in there, make changes, be the kind of, bureaucrat that actually has good working relationships with First Nations. And then I had friends and family and colleagues who said, what are you doing? You're going to work for the traitor. We can never trust you again. Now you're working for the paternalistic Indian agent, especially when I was at Indian Affairs, right? And there are people that, really hold to that. Once you enter government, you're automatically a traitor and there's no good that you can do. And I'd love to hear your response to that.
Thanks for that question. I've been asked that question too, Pam, from people, and I go back to a conversation that I had with my grandfather. My grandfather, George Richardson, was one of my most favorite humans on the planet. And he'd always call me and say, "Hey, how's your little heart?" And I'd be like, "Oh, it's good." I'd say, "How are you?" And he'd be tickety boo, he'd say. But he said to me, he said, Deb, he said, you need to use your mind. You need to use your mind to make change. And I think he said that because he worked with his hands and ended up being a foreman in the Dalhousie Mill, actually. But he said you need to use your mind, and you need to get into places and spaces where our people aren't. And I always thought about that. And we need people everywhere. We need people who are doctors and nurses and teachers and government officials and chiefs and every single elected officials, MPPs and MPs. We need our people everywhere, because that's how you drive change, and that's how you bring voices of those who don't have voices at that table. So I think about, if I hadn't have been in the provincial government when we pushed the federal government on the national inquiry, to hold the national inquiry to end violence against Indigenous women and girls, or to have the response to the TRC, if I wasn't there, would that have happened? It could have, but I don't know, right? If I wasn't sitting at Treasury Board looking at things that were coming through to say, hey, did you talk to Indigenous partners on that? Or for this type of program, how are we going to meet the needs of the North in Ontario? If I wasn't there, would those things have happened, right? Not happened. If I wasn't at corrections, would we have had a lot more Native inmate liaison officers established to go and support people? Would a new facility in Thunder Bay or Kenora have been built to deal with the overcrowding? I don't know, maybe, but I know it helped, that's for sure, right? So I think, the more we're there and we have that voice and we're able to influence change, we're able to do things. Now, are there things that happen that sometimes we might not agree with? For sure. But I always pivot, and I'm ready for the next thing. You might win some battles, you might lose some battles when you're in government, and it's like in every workplace. But you move on to the next and figure out how you can continue to move the yardstick. So I just wanted to share that I don't think it's a traitor. I think we need people everywhere.
I totally agree. And when I was younger and much crankier, I know it's hard to believe, much crankier than I am now, I kind of used to have those all or nothing views. When you're
Me too.
finding your
Me too.
way and you haven't experienced life and you're just spitting fire and you just think you know everything, and it's all with good intentions, right? Like, of course, governments and politicians and businesses and have all done terrible things to Indigenous peoples. But as I've matured and as I've known the people, like when I worked in different government organizations, like there are people who are putting in overtime, and with a salary you don't get overtime,
Yeah.
who are taking their personal time. Like there are people who are fighting the fight. They might not win it on that issue, but they're fighting the fight. And I think I'm really glad that you mentioned, politicians too. Like we do need people everywhere, lawyers and judges, and I think that's how things will change. I tell my students that, because when I teach them about what's happened in the past and what's ongoing, they're like, "Oh, we should never work for government." And I'm like, "No, please. I want your kind of person that knows about this, that cares about social justice. I would rather you be the one that gets hired than someone from, the old ways of thinking that
Yeah.
are not so
Absolutely.
supportive."
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, well, good. I'm glad for that. So just as we're closing out, what are your hopes and dreams? And I know that's a big one. What are your hopes and dreams for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples? And it doesn't just have to be Ontario or in your position, but in general, where would you like to see us head?
So when you listen to the prophecies, and if you're privy to, a lot of different traditional teachings. Like and there actually has been like the 8 fire that Wapkanu did before was, we're in a time of the 7th fire, and there will be a time that our grandchildren will be asked for their knowledge again. And, and together as a whole society, that'll ignite that at 8 fire. And so I think that the more that we make sure that our kids are exposed and are educated about our traditional teachings and our culture and our values, there is going to be a time, and people do come to us, right, as we're starting to be challenged with issues around the environment or, just different ways of being. So, yeah, I think that 8th fire, that time's going to come. And I think that is the future that I see.
I love that, because I've heard that in different ways, whether I'm in Cree territory, Haudenosaunee, Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqey, there's all some similar version of that prophecy. And that's hopeful. That's hopeful, right? And you have to believe, hey, our ancestors were kicking butt and taking names for tens of thousands of years. So
totally,
if that's their prophecy, I'm good with that. Okay, well, Deborah, here's some really quick questions. One, do you have any favorite Indigenous authors? Are there any Native books that you're reading right now that you just find so engaging?
So I love Tanya Talaga's books.
Oh, yes.
I actually, as soon as it came out, I downloaded, I didn't do the podcast this time, but I downloaded just the book itself. And I'm probably about, I don't know, a quarter of the way through. But it was fascinating because I went to CAMH and I was thinking about the sanitarium and stuff was there. And I said to the CEO, I said, have you read Tanya Talaga's book called The Knowing? Because of, I don't know if there's any connection, if that's where it was from. I don't know the unmarked graves and all of that. So anyways, it's awesome. So I love Tanya's stuff and all the stuff that she does to bring forward, the 7 Youth Inquest and all of those pieces. I love her stuff. Connie Walker, the Finding Chloe podcast, and actually my daughter Fiona was the voice of Chloe. And
no way.
Yeah, and one of her friends, Michelle Cataquapit, was her friend, the friend. So yeah, they're in the podcast, but totally love that. And I have to say, one author who is a family member, of course, my brother, Robbie Richardson. He's a professor at Princeton University. But I love this. He used to, so First Nations guy teaching the English at the University of Kent in Canterbury. Like, how awesome is that, right? So he's, he's written, kind of some books like the Savage and Modern Self is kind of in the 18th century when people came here and then they wrote about it and romanticized about it. So that's kind of his area of expertise and kind of material culture. But yeah, he's a professor at Princeton, very proud of him. And he's written lots of really cool publications on like the British depictions of the wampum and the tomahawk and scalping knives trade. And yeah, he's written some really, really interesting articles and publications.
That's awesome. I've got to go and search out his work too, because I am addicted to Indigenous podcasters, Indigenous authors, Indigenous musicians, like you name it. I'm addicted to all of it. And I have to say, when the movie Prey came out and they had a young Indigenous woman,
I know,
not just in the movie, but is the central character and the hero of the movie, I was like, yes, never mind that you could listen to it in Comanche, but I was like, finally, she wasn't portrayed as someone who, gets shot within the first 5 minutes, or, some John Smith has to go rescue her. She's like, I got this. I got this. And I love it. So thank you so much for spending all of this time. Like, I learned so much, and I learned more about you, which I find so fascinating. I think that's one of the reasons why I love this podcast. I get to find out life stories and lessons learned and cool things about people. And you're one of those people that, I really look up to. I will never forget that you reached out and offered words of support during a hard time. And I really appreciate that. And I appreciate what you do for everyone else. And I'm just so thankful to have you on this podcast.
Oh, Will all in. Thank you so much to you too. Like I've always watched you from afar and all of the different things that you do. And, we're really proud of you. Very proud of you.
Well, thank you. And thank you to all the viewers on YouTube, closed caption readers on YouTube, and all of the people who listen to the audio podcast. Thanks for listening. Thanks for taking the time to learn more about Indigenous peoples, Indigenous leaders out there doing amazing things, learning about Indigenous issues. Thank you to all of the teachers and professors who use this as a teaching tool. Like, that is phenomenal. Never did I ever think that would happen. And so thank you for your support. Keep sharing it. Far and wide. Keep doing what you can to support Indigenous peoples. And until next time, keep living a warrior life. Walalia.